Einstein created a revolution, starting with a special theory of relativity in 1905, in which mass, velocity, and so forth was relative to the observer. But the more important one was his general theory of relativity in 1915. And why that's important to you and me is because he recognized that you and I don't live in just 3 dimensions. He recognized that there's a 4th dimension, that Planck's constant is really a 4-dimensional constant. He recognized that there's no distinction between time and space. You and I live in a 4-dimensional or more continuum. And this is no longer a theory, it's been confirmed in 14 different ways to 19 decimal places. So the general theory of relativity is a very, very fundamental insight. But the reason it's important for you and I is we need to understand that time is a physical property. It's not uniform. It varies with mass, acceleration, or gravity, among other things. Now, you and I live in more than 4 dimensions, actually. Actually, we know now that we probably live in about 10. But I'll come back to that. See, the reason we have some misconceptions, when we were in school, the teacher would go to the blackboard and draw a line from left to right. And the left end would be the beginning of something, the birth of a famous person or the founding of an empire. The right end of that line would be the end of the death of that person or the falling of that empire. And all of us have made timelines in school. So when we encounter the concept of eternity, we tend to presume it's sort of like a line. It starts at infinity on the left and goes to infinity on the right. We think of eternity as simply having lots of time, an unlimited amount of time. And that makes colorful poetry. It's one of our verses in our hymns, An Amazing Grace, tends to presume that in effect. But let's ask ourselves a few questions. Let's talk about God. Is God subject to the restrictions of mass, acceleration, or gravity? Hardly. So God is not somebody who has lots of time. He is one who is outside the restrictions of time altogether. And that's exactly what Isaiah tells us, that thus saith the high and lofty one, that inhabiteth eternity. Now, if he has the technology to create us in the first place, he has the technology to get a message to us. The question is, how does he authenticate his message? How does he let us know the message we receive is really from him and not some kind of contrivance or some kind of a fraud? One way he authenticates it is to rely on an attribute that's unique to him, that he's outside the dimensionality of time. And so that's exactly what Isaiah tells us in Isaiah 46, verse 10, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, the things that are not yet done. God authenticates his message, among other things, by writing history before it happens, demonstrating that the origin is from outside time. So let's talk a little bit what I'll call the geometry of eternity. I've used a line horizontally in 2 dimensions here, but imagine this line that I'm showing on the screen is coming out at you in a 3rd dimension. And in the back part of the line is the past. Where we are, we'll call it the present, and what's ahead of us is the future. For us, life and time is a sequence of events from the past through the present to the future. But for someone who's outside the dimensionality of that timeline, say in what we call eternity, from that vantage point, they can see the past, the present, the future simultaneously. We can't imagine that because we are limited in our thinking to the dimensionality that we're constrained to. But someone that is outside the dimensionality, that's no problem. Let me give you something you might be able to visualize. Imagine you're sitting on a curb watching a parade. Around the corner comes the marching units, the bands, the troops, whatever. And as they come by, for you, the parade is a sequence of events. They come around this corner, they go down the street, they go on down that way. For someone who's outside the plane of that existence, say in a helicopter above the parade, they can see the staging area where the units are forming up. They can watch the parade as it snakes through the city that it's going in, and they can also see where it's disbanded, going back to storage or whatever. So they can see simultaneously the beginning, what's happening, and the end from their vantage point. It's perhaps a clumsy analogy, but it gets across the idea that another dimension adds all kinds of capabilities. Well, let me talk a little bit more about the geometry of eternity. We talked before about this line. Behind us is the past, ahead of us is the future. And God, of course, can see the end from the beginning. You recall this from the earlier session. I want you to notice something. I'm just going to suggest a speculative possibility to stretch your horizons here. Those arrows can point the other way. Somebody that died in the past, someone that died last week, and someone that gets raptured, say, 3 weeks from Tuesday, all could arrive at the throne simultaneously because they're outside the dimensionality of time as we know it.